Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Recently, Mark at Book Time with Elvis put up a video where he gave some insights into what it means when someone says a book is a classic. His discussion is thoughtful and pretty comprehensive. And then he ends by asking all of us to participate in naming some of the classics we love ourselves, classics that fit into particular prompts. At first, I was so struck by the question that I didn't pay much attention to the prompts, perhaps especially because he doesn't actually start to answer those prompts himself yet, at least not in that initial video. But what an interesting question. I found myself thinking a lot about what he said there. What are the defining characteristics of, quote, classics? Luckily, other people were much quicker to respond to the full complexity of his tag, and they added additional brilliant ideas about what Mark sketched out as the definition of classic literature. But I'll throw in my own favorite addition, one I've said before in a variety of contexts. A classic is a book that cannot be spoiled. Classic books reward reading and rereading over a lifetime. Even if the plot payoff of letting the plot unfold naturally is high, what we gain when we reread a classic might even be higher. Knowing the so-called plot spoilers, well, it doesn't spoil anything at all, and in fact, sometimes helps us see even more powerful and lasting aspects of classic books. But the tag Mark proposed, based on a publishing company's blog post, asks us not so much for our definitions of a classic, but our choices for books in particular categories. One really excellent response was by the excellent booktuber Aaron Facer. I loved his answers, but I especially loved the way he chose who to tag. He looked at the books he had in front of him, the books he'd chosen to name in response to the tag prompts, and thought of the booktubers they reminded him of. When he got to War and Peace, he said my name. And he said a lot of extraordinarily kind things about the videos I had made when I first started reading War and Peace. And he tenderly mentioned that he thought I might not have been able to finish that series of videos. And he was right. Things got complicated and really hard and sad in my household recently. But I think I'm almost ready to get back to War and Peace. Maybe not until 2024, but soon. At least, maybe. Thank you, Aaron. So, let's get on to the actual prompts. Each one asks us to name a book that meets particular characteristics, partly in an effort to force myself to think of some answers that other booktubers have not already talked about in this tag. I've decided to focus on a particular kind of literature. Using this strategy, I took Roz as a model. Roz of the wonderful channel Scalladaddling About the Books. Her limitation was to answer with books from the 17th century and earlier. After thinking for a bit, I've decided to use books written by American women. So here goes. The first prompt, the one with a gripping plot and universal themes. For this prompt, I'm going to choose a beloved American novel from the 19th century, Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. The universal theme I want to mention is the story of how these four different young people, a set of sisters in New England and the U.S. during the 19th century, make choices in their lives and approach adulthood in very different ways. Louisa May Alcott presents this key question of how people grow up and make decisions about who they want to become, decisions that sometimes go against what their families or cultures expect or want. Both the character of Jo and the character of Amy choose careers, one as a writer and one as an artist, that require them to consider how their choice of partners might support or not support their work. Eldest sister Meg makes a very different kind of decision. What I love in this book is that we get a variety of models of how young people find ways to become fully realized adults while grappling with social expectations of their cultures and families. Technically, Alcott is looking explicitly at how young women approach independence, and Alcott was writing at a time when women's independence was much more constrained than it is today. But that idea of finding a way for all young people, little women and everyone else, to grow up, that idea of sometimes making decisions very different from the decisions one's loved ones might have made, is of crucial importance. And at the same time, so is the emphasis on the importance of maintaining bonds with family and community, even when one makes very different choices about how to live one's life. I've loved this book since I was a very little girl, but now I'm thinking more about how Alcott also shows parents a way to appreciate and to honor the choices their children make, even when they might imagine life in radically different ways. Prompt number 2, the subversive one. Well, I suppose I should say the subversive 2, since I'm going to name a couple of books. The first was a book considered subversive by readers at the time, but now it seems pretty regressive, Uncle Tom's Cabin, by white author Harriet Beecher Stowe. This book was explicitly anti-slavery and often acknowledged as a key contributor to the coming of the American Civil War in the 1860s. As a side note, I'm reading a relatively contemporary book right now whose author assumes that anti-slavery activists were all anti-racist too. And more on that book in a different video. But that parallelism just wasn't the way things always worked. But this book was, in fact, an effort to be anti-racist to a degree, even though it's abundantly obvious that Stowe nevertheless reflected racist assumptions of her time. She accepted stereotypes, and he even helped ingrain them within a particular kind of sentimentality in literature. While I'm certainly not suggesting that readers uninterested in an historical approach to literature choose to read this book right now, I hope you'll accept that Uncle Tom's Cabin was an early model of a kind of protest novel we see developing in the coming decades, from Upton Sinclair's The Jungle to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Interestingly, Brian at Bookish also briefly mentioned the subversive nature of Stowe's book and the limits of that subversiveness in his video this morning. I'll leave a link to his video in the description box below. The second subversive book I'll choose is Passing by Nella Larsen. Written in the late 1920s, Passing is the story of two young black women in New York, in Harlem, an area of the city with a high percentage of African Americans, as well as a vibrant cultural scene during that period, who have tried in very different ways to address the discrimination of the time. The title refers to racial passing. One of the two main characters has chosen to pass as a white woman, even keeping her background a secret from her husband. But the novel, or rather the novella, also explores the complexity and flexibility of gender identity and sexual identity. These issues mean that Larsen's book was seen as subversive at the time, and that it still is almost 100 years later. The third prompt, the one which defines a time and a place. Here again, I want to mention two books, two stories written about very different places and cultures. The first is Willa Cather's My Antonia. Published in 1918, this is the story of how a young man born in Virginia, in the U.S. South, made a deep connection with a young woman, an immigrant from what was then called Bohemia, on the prairie lands of Nebraska in the late 19th century. I first read this book as a teenager, and I don't know how many times I've read it since, but I find myself more and more enthralled by it. This is one of those books where everyone recognizes that the setting, the prairie of the American Midwest, is actually a major character. radically different. The second book, which I think helps us understand a particular time and place, is Delta Wedding by Eudora Welty, which I think I've mentioned on this channel before. This is the story of a cross-class wedding in the U.S. South, and how a whole variety of people from different positions and different generations respond to it. While Welty's book was set at about the same time that Willa Cather's book was published, Welty didn't write it until 20 years or so later. The literary scene had undergone a pretty radical change by then. While I would certainly call this book a classic, I'll point out that it's fundamentally a study of a variety of different characters and their conflicting perspectives, far more than any fast-paced plot. It isn't a book for everyone, but I love it with a deep passion. Okay, prompt number 4, the complex, groundbreaking one. The 2 books I have in mind for this were both published in my lifetime. The first is The Woman Warrior by Maxine Kingston. This book blends memoir and mythology, a past of Asian experiences and a present of American identity, the conflicting voices of multiple generations, etc. In general, for this tag, I've chosen works of fiction, but this is not really fiction, even though it reads like an experimental novel in many ways. Everything gets woven together with links we might never expect. The second example of a complex and groundbreaking book is Toni Morrison's Beloved. Actually, let me change my answer. Her first novel, The Bluest Eye, written nearly 20 years earlier in 1970, might be more experimental in a literary sense, starting even in the first few pages with the words of the Dick and Jane books. Stories about what I'm going to call perfect and aggressively white children in early readers designed to teach youngsters to read. Those stories get used in a way that signals the complexity of the novel as a whole. I promise to talk about Beloved in some future video, and certainly it too would make perfect sense as an answer here. Prompt number 5, the ones with archetypal characters. Here I'll go with To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Scout, a young white girl growing up in Alabama during the Depression, serves as the archetype of an innocent child who goes through a passage towards maturity. Her father, Atticus, is the sage, or perhaps the hero, passing out wisdom and doing the right thing, at least as this book is usually read, even though he knows he will fail. Tom, a black man wrongfully accused of rape, serves as a convenient scapegoat in the racist society. Boo Radley represents the unknown stranger in our midst, who turns out to be kind. And Calpurnia is the motherly presence who helps Scout go from child to young woman, despite the racial difference that Scout only partially understands. Yet again, I find myself talking about a book I'm not sure I've discussed in any detail on this channel, and that I want to reread for the upteenth time and try to make sense of anew. The 6th prompt, the one that's a complete one-off. I'm choosing a book that is a one-off for me, a book by Edith Wharton that I do not love. The backstory here is long and tedious, which I will tell another time, but I read her novel Ethan Frome when I was in late high school, and I absolutely hated it. I hated it so much that I did not read any other Edith Wharton for years. And when I did, I tried Age of Innocence and absolutely loved it. Then I read House of Mirth and loved it even more, if that's possible, etc. But I still have not gone back to Ethan Frome. Perhaps I would have a really different reaction now. And maybe I'll put it on my 2024 TBR or something, along with the rest of War and Peace. Again, no promises. Prompt number 7, the one we quote from all the time. When we think about the literary material we quote from all the time, I think many of us first think of Shakespeare. In fact, a friend of mine, unfamiliar with Hamlet and seeing it for the first time on stage, was absolutely startled by how many lines she already knew. Her first response was to wonder how Shakespeare could get by with, quote, stealing so many of the classic lines, until she realized that he had originated all of them. But Shakespeare, as you might already be thinking, is not an American woman. And I think I'm going to choose an author that I personally quote from a lot. Actually, when I first introduced this author to some young students at summer camp a few decades ago, they too started to quote from her work. That is Flannery O'Connor, the amazing short story writer from the U.S. South. As an example of one of the quotes, when the campers and I were in a camp van pulling out of the parking lot to head to an event, the driver of the van accidentally bumped very, very gently into another car. All of the kids immediately started excitedly reciting a line from O'Connor's story, A Good Man is Hard to Find. "We've had an accident! We've had an accident!" And then a few days later, well, this one requires just a bit of a weird setup. On the weekends at camp, there was always a dance held outside on the library steps for these early teen campers. The residential assistants came up with a silly way to help the kids adjust a bit socially and make some new friends. Before the dance, they circulated a list of questions, calling it the computer dance questionnaire for some reason, even though absolutely no computers were involved. One of the prompts on the questionnaire was to name your favorite pickup line. Well, every single one of my Southern Lit students wrote down the same quote from Flannery O'Connor's wonderful story, Good Country People. "Show me where your wooden leg joins on." As the residential staff went through these answers, they were definitely a bit concerned. But let's go on. The final prompt, the rediscovered classic, or a book you believe should be a classic in the future. One of my favorite books that's become a rediscovered classic during my lifetime is Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. Like Nella Larsen's Passing, this book was written during the Harlem Renaissance, just a little bit later than Nella Larsen's. But it's set in a Black community in a small town in Florida, not in a neighborhood of New York City. Major late Harlem Renaissance authors, men like Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison, hated her books. One of the main critiques that she got was that her novel embraced or perhaps even romanticized the language and culture connected to people who had little access to higher education. Perhaps it seemed sentimental in some of the same ways that white author Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin might have felt much too sentimental and therefore racist. But that attitude changed pretty radically over the next many decades. In the 70s and 80s, scholars of Black history and literature were interested in rediscovering and reclaiming the literature of previous times written by African American authors. The novelist Alice Walker, author of the hugely popular The Color Purple, published a 1975 article in Ms. Magazine about Hurston, arguing that the Black intelligentsia were, quote, throwing away a genius by dismissing Hurston's work. And by 1978, Their Eyes Were Watching God was back in print. And it's a book that appeals not only to contemporary readers, but also to contemporary scholars of both literature and history. Okay, well, that will do it for this tag. I'm so glad Aaron tagged me for this very cool set of prompts. And thanks to all of you for joining me today here on Hannah's Books.